Hey there! Buckle up for an incredible journey back in time. Imagine a world where warriors didn't just buy their weapons. They summoned them straight from the muddy depths of a swamp. That's right. We're diving into the gritty, fiery world of Viking blacksmiths, who turned slimy bog mud into deadly axes with nothing but raw skill, relentless determination, and a whole lot of fire. These weren't just tools. They were weapons of legend, forged with secrets that modern tech can barely replicate. Stick with me, because we're about to uncover how they transformed filth into ferocity, step by grueling step, in a process so intense it'll leave you in awe. Let's start at the very beginning, in the cold, damp bogs of ancient Scandinavia. Picture this: a group of rugged Vikings wading through a stinking swamp, the air thick with a rotten smell of sulfur. They're not there for a casual stroll. They're hunting for bog iron, the raw, sludgy treasure that's the secret ingredient of their craft. This isn't shiny metal ore. It's a messy mix of iron and bacteria that forms when iron-rich groundwater bubbles up and mixes with oxygen, creating a slimy goo. Yeah, it sounds nasty, and trust me, it was. But over time, this goo hardens into small, lumpy nodules of iron hidden in the mud. A single crew of blacksmiths could haul out as much as 1,100 pounds of this stuff in just a week, scraping it from the swamp with rough wooden rakes until their hands were raw and bleeding. That's the kind of grit we're talking about. Pure, backbreaking labor before the real work even started. Once they dragged these iron nodules out of the bog, the Vikings had to clean them up. They'd smash the lumps with heavy hammers to break off bits of clay and dirt stuck inside. This wasn't just busy work. It was critical. If they skipped this step and threw the raw nodules into a fire, trapped water inside the clay would heat up, turn to steam, and explode, sending molten muck flying everywhere. Imagine the chaos of a workshop splattered with burning sludge just because someone got lazy. So they took their time, drying out the iron lumps and preparing them for the next brutal stage. But getting the raw material was only the first hurdle. The real test of skill and danger was about to begin with building a furnace that could burn hotter than the gates of the underworld. Now, let's picture ourselves in a damp forest clearing, kneeling in the cold mud with nothing but our hands and a pile of clay. We're not making pottery. We're crafting a furnace that needs to hit a mind-blowing 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt stone into liquid. Viking blacksmiths didn't have fancy blueprints or modern tools. They relied on pure instinct and experience, mixing river clay with crushed shells and straw to make a sturdy material that wouldn't crack under extreme heat. Even so, about 40% of these furnaces collapsed during the first firing, turning hours of work into a pile of rubble. They shaped the furnace into a short cylinder, about 3 feet tall, with a narrow opening at the top to trap heat while allowing a blast of oxygen to fuel the flames. There were no thermometers back then, so they judged the temperature by the color of the glow. Bright yellow meant it was just right, while a dull red meant they were wasting precious charcoal. To keep the fire roaring, they carved a small hole on the side of the furnace, called a tuyere, where they attached bellows to pump in air. This little mouth was a double-edged sword, though. It helped the fire burn hotter, but a single stray spark could shoot out and set a blacksmith's clothes on fire. In fact, archaeologists digging in Denmark found scorched bits of fabric near ancient furnace sites, proof that this job could literally burn you alive if you weren't careful. But that was the deal. No heat, no iron, and without iron, there'd be no axe. The risk was worth it for a weapon that could turn the tide of battle. So, how did they take this messy pile of bog iron and turn it into something they could actually shape? Let's dive into the heart of the fire and find out. With the clay furnace finally dry and ready, it was time to load it up. They'd shovel in alternating layers. About 40 pounds of bog iron ore, then 40 pounds of charcoal, over and over. Charcoal wasn't just fuel. It burned way hotter than any regular campfire, pushing the temperature past 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit. But here's the catch. To keep that heat steady, they had to pump the bellows non-stop for 6 to 8 hours. No breaks, no sitting down, just relentless pumping. If they stopped even for a moment, the iron would cool and turn into a useless lump of slag, wasting all their effort. In one modern experiment, researchers figured it took around 18,000 pumps of the bellows to complete a single smelt. That's pure endurance. When everything went right, though, the result was pure magic. After hours of sweat and fire, they'd see a bloom, a spongy, glowing mass of pure iron, weighing about 25 pounds, shining bright orange in the furnace. To get it out, they'd smash open the furnace wall with a wooden mallet, a nerve-wracking moment where one wrong move could send the bloom tumbling into the dirt, ruining a week's worth of work. Even if they got it out safely, they were only halfway done. The bloom was still raw and needed to be hammered into shape before it cooled into an unworkable brick. Time was ticking, and every second counted. How did they turn this ugly lump into a weapon of war? Let's crank up the heat and find out. Pulling a 25-pound iron bloom from the furnace was like grabbing a piece of the sun. It was scorching hot, and they had mere seconds to act before it cooled into something too hard to shape. The blacksmiths would rush it to an anvil, a massive slab of stone or iron, and start hammering like their lives depended on it. Because in a way, they did. Every strike of the hammer forced out impurities called slag, glassy bits that could make the iron brittle. If too much slag stayed inside, the axe would shatter the first time it hit something hard, like an enemy's shield. They'd spend hours, sometimes 4 straight hours, pounding that bloom, each blow needing to be just right. Hit too softly, and the slag wouldn't budge. Hit too hard, and the bloom could split in half, sending weeks of labor down the drain. Viking blacksmiths used heavy sledgehammers, often weighing 10 pounds, swinging them in a steady rhythm to shape the iron. Archaeologists have found ancient forge pits stained black, with tiny iron flakes that flew off with every hit, a testament to the sheer force of this work. And here's something you won't see in most history shows. The noise was unbearable. The constant clang of hammer on iron was so loud that some smiths stuffed sheep's wool into their ears to avoid going deaf by their 30s. Even after all that hammering, the bloom didn't look like an axe yet, just a lumpy, rough ingot. But inside that lump was potential, waiting to be unleashed. The question is, how did they shape it into a razor-sharp blade without modern tools? Let's see where raw strength meets delicate skill. Now imagine holding that lumpy piece of iron, still glowing orange from the heat, and flattening it into an axe head by hand. That's what came next. They'd reheat the bloom to around 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, grip it with giant tongs, and hammer it over and over to stretch the metal into a rough blade shape. The trick was keeping the iron hot enough to be workable, but not so hot that it started to burn away. If sparks flew off like fireworks, they knew they were losing precious metal to oxidation, turning their future axe into useless flakes. Viking axes weren't just chunks of iron either. The cutting edge had to be hard enough to slice through bone, while the body needed to stay tough to absorb the shock of impact. To achieve this, smiths folded the iron over itself, welding the layers together with a special flux made from silica, which acted like a sticky glue to bind the metal. But here's the part no one glamorizes. Sometimes, the weld failed. One wrong swing of the hammer, and the carefully folded blade would split open like a broken cookie. That meant starting over, reheating, rewelding, and hoping for better luck, all while the iron cooled and hardened with every passing second. If they didn't work fast enough, they'd end up beating cold, brittle steel that wouldn't budge. Even when the shape looked good, it wasn't ready yet. The blade still needed a crucial step to transform it from a rough tool into a true weapon of war. Let's see how they turned soft iron into something harder than stone. Once the axe blade took shape, it was still too soft, more like warm clay than tough steel. To fix that, they had to harden it through a process called quenching, and this was a gamble every single time. They'd reheat the blade to a cherry red glow, around 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, judging the temperature purely by eye since they had no tools to measure it. Too cool, and the edge would stay dull forever. Too hot, and the blade could warp or crack under the stress. When the color was just right, they'd pull it from the coals and plunge it into a vat of animal fat, or believe it or not, stale urine. Yes, you heard that right. This sudden cooling, or quenching, changed the iron structure on a tiny level, making it incredibly hard. But it came with a huge risk: thermal shock. The blade could snap in half with a loud crack, destroying hours of work in a split second. There's an old Viking story about a blacksmith who lost 3 blades in one day to cracking. Frustrated, he threw his hammer across the forge and swore he'd never touch iron again. That sharp ping of a breaking blade was a sound that haunted every smith worse than any battle cry. Even if the blade survived quenching, it wasn't done. It still needed sharpening, polishing, and a personal touch that every Viking valued, a mark to prove it was ready for war. Let's see how they put the final deadly touches on this masterpiece. If the quenching worked, the blade was now harder than bone, but it was rough, covered in black scale and jagged edges. Sharpening came next, and this took almost as long as forging. Blacksmiths used whetstones, soaked in water or animal fat, to grind the edge smooth. Some of these stones were imported from far away, like fine Norwegian schist that felt silky to the touch. A good edge took hours of patient grinding, moving the blade in slow, careful arcs until it was sharp enough to slice through a thin cloak in midair. But they couldn't make it too thin, or it would chip in combat. So, they often added a tiny angle, called a micro-bevel, to make the edge more durable. This wasn't just about function. Vikings believed an unfinished blade brought bad luck. A dull weapon could fail in battle, or worse, shame you in front of your clan. That's why every blacksmith carved a maker's mark, a rune or a small line near the axe eye. It was their signature, a sign of pride, but also a warning. If the blade broke, everyone would know who made it. There's an old saying from the Viking sagas: the axe remembers the hand that forged it. Mess up, and your reputation was ruined. But get it right, and you held something truly fearsome. A blade forged with sweat, fire, and just enough fear to make you respect its power. But even now, the axe wasn't complete. It needed one final piece to become a true weapon. Let's see what that was. No matter how perfect the blade, It was useless without a handle strong enough to withstand the chaos of war. Vikings called this part the hell, and it had to be crafted with just as much care as the iron. They chose ash wood for its long, flexible fibers that could absorb shock without splitting. A single branch, seasoned for over a year to dry out properly, was carved into a tapered shape to fit tightly into the axe eye. Getting the fit right was a battle of its own. They'd pound the handle in with a wooden mallet, sometimes muttering curses at the stubborn wood. Too loose, and the head would fly off mid-swing. Too tight, and the eye of the axe might crack under the pressure. Some handles were wrapped with rawhide strips soaked in water, which shrank as it dried to lock everything in place. Others got iron rings hammered on for extra strength. A well-made handle could take thousands of blows before loosening. But here's a hidden risk. If the wood grain ran the wrong way, the handle could snap on the very first hit, wasting weeks of work. More than one blacksmith burned a failed handle in frustration before starting over. The handles were also shaped with a slight forward curve, not for looks, but to make the axe bite deeper with less effort, like a lever built for destruction. Every part of this final step was a quiet gamble, but when it all came together, you had a weapon that could outlive its maker. So, there you have it. The incredible story of how Viking blacksmiths turned swamp mud into axes that struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. From hauling sludgy bog iron, hammering glowing blooms, from risking fiery explosions to crafting handles that wouldn't snap. Every step was a test of skill, patience, and raw courage. These weren't just weapons. They were symbols of a craft pushed to its limits. If this blew your mind, stick around. And in our next video, we'll watch Vikings build an entire ship in just 10 hours using methods that defy belief. You won't want to miss it.